given these preliminary remarks about Austin's key ideas, now let us start discussing what Strawson thinks of these Austinian notions, how Strawson understands the relation between these notions of Austin and the questions that Strawson raises. As we have mentioned earlier, Strawson wants to raise few questions about Austin's idea of illocutionary force and illocutionary act. Strawson starts his discussion with two preliminary remarks. First, Austin distinguishes what he calls the normal or serious use of speech act with etiolated or parasitical use. So Austin distinguishes the serious use of speech act from the parasitical use of the speech act. And when Austin talks about illocutionary force, he is essentially talking about this serious use of speech act. Okay. So one could very well question this Austinian distinction of serious use of speech act and parasitical use of speech act. Strawson is not bothered about the viability of this distinction. Strawson accepts or assumes this distinction, and then he goes on analyzing Austin's key ideas. The second preliminary remark that Strawson makes refers to Austin's distinction between the illocutionary force of an utterance from meaning. So this is the distinction that Austin makes. Austin distinguishes the illocutionary force of an utterance from the meaning of an utterance. Okay? And Austin also distinguishes illocutionary and locutionary acts performed in issuing an utterance. So there are two pairs of distinctions that Strawson is referring to. One is the distinction between illocutionary force of an utterance and the meaning of an utterance. This is one set of distinction. The second set of distinction that Austin makes, which Strawson refers to, is a distinction between illocutionary and locutionary act. Strawson thinks that one could express doubts about Austin's idea of meaning and Austin's idea of locutionary act. One could raise doubts, one could question Austin's formulation of what is known as meaning and also what is called locutionary act in Austin's philosophy. Strawson is not concerned with such skepticisms about Austin's idea of meaning and Austin's idea of locutionary act. Strawson starts with the assumption that the meaning of an utterance, in Austinian sense, the meaning of an utterance always puts some limitation on its force, on its illocutionary force. In some cases, the meaning of an utterance might exhaust the illocutionary force, implying thereby that there is no more to the illocutionary force of the utterance than whatever the meaning is expressed by that utterance. But sometimes meaning does not exhaust the force. In other words, what Strawson is hinting at is this: what is the relation between meaning as understood by Austin? What is the relation between meaning and the illocutionary force? In some cases, it might seem that they are in fact identical. The meaning of an expression and the illocutionary force of an expression. In some cases. But in some other cases, meaning does not exhaust its force. In other words, in some cases, meaning is something more than the illocutionary force of the expression concerned. So the relation between the meaning of an expression and the illocutionary force of an expression is a complex one. Okay? In some cases, they might be, they might be identical. In some cases, meaning might consist of something more than the illocutionary force. Similarly, what about the relation between illocutionary force of an utterance and the locutionary act that has been performed? What is the relation between the two? Sometimes illocutionary force of an utterance might simply be identical with what we know if we know what locutionary act has been performed. So in some cases, knowledge of the illocutionary force is the same as the knowledge of the locutionary act. in some cases. But in some other cases, to know the illocutionary force of an utterance is to know more than what consists in knowing the locutionary act. So knowledge of locutionary act and knowledge of illocutionary force, what is the relation between these two? This is what Strawson is commenting on. In some cases, if we know what locutionary act has been performed, we might claim to know the illocutionary force. But in some cases, it is not the case. In some cases, and Strawson actually holds that it is more often to know more about the illocutionary force of an utterance than knowing what locutionary act has been performed. So in most often what happens according to Strawson is knowing what locutionary act is performed is not enough to know the illocutionary force. So in order to have a knowledge of the illocutionary force, you have to know the locutionary act and something else. Okay? So this is how Strawson formulates the distinction between meaning and illocutionary force on the one hand, and locutionary act and illocutionary force on the other. So these are the two preliminary remarks that Strawson makes in the very beginning of his paper. Then Strawson comments on what Austin means by the force of an utterance and what he means by an illocutionary act. So Strawson is now trying to explain what Austin means by illocutionary act and what Austin means by the force of an utterance. If an utterance with the illocutionary force of, say, warning, so the speaker performs an illocutionary act, the result of which is the birth of a force called warning, right? So if an utterance with the illocutionary force, say warning, is not understood in this way, is not understood as warning, so if the hearer fails to understand the speaker's illocutionary act, namely warning, okay, then the illocutionary act of warning cannot be said to have been actually performed. So if the hearer does not take the speaker as giving a warning, then the speaker cannot be said to perform an illocutionary act of warning. Right? So you see, the interesting consequence of this is the successful performance of an illocutionary act rests on how the hearer understands it, how the hearer interprets the speaker. Strawson quotes from Austin, the performance of an illocutionary act involves the securing of uptake. That is, it involves bringing about the understanding of the meaning and of the force of the locution. So if the hearer does not understand the speaker as performing the act of warning, then we could say that the speaker has failed to generate the force of his locution, namely warning. So Strawson holds that to know the force of an utterance is the same thing as to know what illocutionary act was actually performed in issuing it. Okay? So to know the force of an utterance is to know what illocutionary act has been performed. Okay? So one is in a position to have a knowledge of the force, what kind of force that has been produced allegedly in the hearer. To know that is to know what or which particular illocutionary act has been performed. Next, Strawson analyzes and argues that to know the illocutionary force of the utterance, we must know the answer to some further questions. Okay. So remember, what we are doing here following Strawson is trying to analyze the idea of knowing the illocutionary force. So we are explaining this idea, knowing the illocutionary force. What it is to know the illocutionary force. This is the question that Strawson is addressing with reference to Austin. So what it is to know the illocutionary force of an utterance? Well, a locutionary act is an act of saying something, as has been explained by Austin. An illocutionary act is an act we perform in saying something. Notice the distinction of saying something and in saying something. So a locutionary act is an act of saying something. I utter an expression. But by uttering an expression, I also perform an act. So this is called illocutionary act. It is what we do, means illocutionary act is what we do in saying what we say. Very nicely put. Illocutionary act is what we do, what we perform in saying what we say. Okay. Second point that Strawson raises is, it is sufficient, although not necessary, according to Strawson, that an illocutionary act must be performed by using a verb that can figure in the first person present indicative. First person present indicative. I promise, I declare, I pronounce. These are the usual examples of illocutionary acts. But Strawson things, okay, it is not necessary for an illocutionary act to to uh, to frame itself in such a way where the verb in the sentence always be in the present person, in the first person present indicative mood, where the verb, where the form of the verb is in the first person present indicative mood. They are called by Austin explicit performative. Explicit performative. The grammatical form of the sentence will tell you that this is a performative utterance. Okay, I promise, I pronounce, etc. But there might be other kinds of illocutionary acts which might not be explicitly formulated in this way. Okay, so the verb being in the present, in the first person present indicative mood is not necessary, is not a necessary condition for detecting or determining an illocutionary act. Moreover, the illocutionary act is a conventional act, according to Austin. The illocutionary act is a conventional act, an act done conforming to a convention. So, if an illocutionary act is a conventional act, this illocutionary act is to be contrasted with the producing of certain effects by means of an utterance. Okay, because producing certain effects by means of an utterance might not be a conventional act, whereas performing an illocutionary act is always a conventional act. How do you recognize that the speaker has performed the act of warning, for example? Because in, for example, English language, we have a convention, we follow a convention that if the words are formulated, or if the words are arranged in this particular way, okay, and if that arrangement of words is spoken in this kind of intonation, then it should be considered as a warning. But this is a conventional act. So illocutionary act is a conventional act, whereas the effect that it produces may be intentional, may not be intentional. Okay, that is not a conventional act. So it is no way a conventional. Okay, and for Austin, it is important to regard the illocutionary act as conventional in nature. So where illocutionary act is conventional in nature, the effect that it produces in the hearer's mind is not conventional. Okay, I mean, if you make a request to somebody, in some society that request might be considered as an order. In English there is a proverb saying, "Your wish is my order." So when your superior, your boss, expresses his wish as an employee, as a subordinate employee, you can consider that wish expressed by your boss as an order. But insofar as illocutionary acts are concerned, these are two distinct, different acts, expressing a wish and giving an order.